Hey everybody, welcome to episode 3 of Mr. Wallenfang talking to himself alone in a classroom about grammar. Today's lesson is going to be a little bit shorter than some of the other ones we've been looking at because there are only two smaller concerns that I want to finish up before we move into the midterm, but they are two important concerns because in the last round of writing, I saw a lot of errors with both active versus passive voice and apostrophes. So that's what we're going to be tackling today as our final major grammar concepts for semester one. I'd encourage you slash require you to please take some notes in your notebooks as we go throughout this. There will be one section where I actually want you to write down some sentences in your notes. So make sure that you follow along with this, write down important concepts and ideas, and be ready to bring those into class along with any questions that you have for tomorrow. So what I want to start off with is this concept of active versus passive voice, which I'm going to explain to you in just a minute. But before I even give you a definition for what it is, I just want to show you a couple of sentences that I wrote, but that were based and modeled on your own writing, things that I have seen in your journals or in your essays lately. So I'll just read these sentences to you really quickly. And I'd ask you to try to identify what you think is similar about all of these sentences, because there's something in common that they all have. The monster is being slain by Odysseus. Her stuff was picked up that day. The movie was hated by everyone. The cake was eaten by them. Your bike has been stolen. So if you take a look at the construction of these sentences, like I said, there is something unfamiliar. Even if you can't necessarily put your finger on the grammatical concept, which is totally fine, they all look relatively the same. They all read relatively the same. And in fact, what they have in common is that these are all considered to be passive sentences. And that's what we want to avoid in our writing. So these are all passive sentences. That's great. But what does that mean in terms of grammar? We're going to come back to this slide in just a second. If you employ passive voice versus active voice in your writing, which many of you are doing at this point in time, it means that you are removing or diminishing the subject and the actions of the subject in the sentence. Often we call this, or you'll hear me refer to it as, the agency of the subject. If you have agency, it means that you are capable of doing something. And if you use passive voice, it removes the ability of a subject to do something in the sentence. So in other words, what happens then is if you remove agency, it seems like the subject actually isn't performing an action. It becomes very passive in the sentence. And what's even worse is that sometimes we write sentences, if we're using passive voice, in which the subject completely disappears. It just is no longer existent. We have no idea who or what is performing the main action of the sentence. And this is something that we definitely want to avoid in our writing. We want to make our sentences active, which means we can identify a subject very clearly, and the subject is clearly linked to its action. It has agency, and it makes sense. We're going to flip back and take a look at these previous sentences for just a second, but before we do, I just want to highlight this little rule right here. Now, this is kind of a rule of thumb. It obviously doesn't apply to every single situation, so I want to say that right off the get-go before I read it. But often, when you write a sentence that's passive, forms of the verb to be, which we've been talking about all semester, are clues that you may be using passive voice. So if you write a ton of sentences that are always using the verb to be, you might possibly have a sentence that is passive. But again, every time that you use the verb to be does not mean that you have a passive sentence. So what does it mean if you do have a passive sentence and you are using the form to be? Well, let's take a look at these ones again. I said, of course, that these are all passive. The monster is being slain by Odysseus. If I were to ask you what the subject of that sentence is, some of you may say monster, but the correct answer is Odysseus, because Odysseus is slaying the monster. So the sentence itself actually works backwards when you use passive voice, and the subject comes at the end. This is the actual subject here. And some of you might say, well, but Mr. Wallenfang, why wouldn't monster be the subject? It's a noun. You have to remember, every single noun is not a subject of the sentence. The subject of a sentence performs the action and is linked to the predicate, which is being slain. That is our verb phrase, right? Now you'll notice we've got is and being. Those are forms of to be, and the construction of this sentence then becomes passive. The monster is being slain by Odysseus. Okay, so this is an example where the subject actually comes at the very end of the sentence, making the sentence passive. If I skip into this next one, her stuff was picked up that day, and I asked you to identify the subject, It would not be stuff. It would not be her, because stuff and her are not picking anything up, right? Who is picking this stuff up is the question that we would ask. By whom? We don't know. There is no subject. This one actually has no subject at all, which means this is extremely passive because we have no idea who is performing the action in this sentence, right? Once again, here's our clue that we have a form of to be here. That form of to be is linking not the subject and the predicate. Exactly. It just is there to create a passive construction within the sentence. And we can go on to the next sentences. The movie was hated by everyone. The cake was eaten by them. Your bike has been stolen. Again, following the passive form. But I'm going to skip those because what I want to do is switch over to active examples so you can start to see the difference between them. So once again, if we return back to the monster was slayed by Odysseus, the first sentence that we looked at, if we wanted to convert it to an active sentence, we could say Odysseus slayed the monster. And in this case, the subject comes first instead of at the end, like in the previous example that we looked at. Okay? We have subject, we have predicate right here, and it makes sense they're linked. Her stuff was picked up by that day, or that day. That was our sentence that had no subject. If we were to rewrite it to be active, we would just say, her mom picked up her stuff that day. Now we know who is doing the action. We now have a subject linked to the predicate. The movie was hated by everyone. This is our subject. It comes at the end again, just like in this example with Odysseus. If we wanted to create it active, everyone hated the movie. The cake was eaten by them. Same thing. Subject at the end. They ate the cake. Your bike has been stolen. By whom? Someone stole your bike. Subject, predicate. Okay? So often, for our purposes, what I want you to be able to do is to be able to switch sentences into active voice so that subjects generally come first and that subjects are present in the sentence. Now, if we're talking about literary analysis, which is, of course, what our focus has been so far this term, is writing literary analyses. If we look at these sentences here, I modeled these off of sentences that you guys have been writing recently in your essays or in your journal responses. And what I'm going to do now is actually ask you to read these sentences to yourself. All of them are passive, and I want you to try to turn them active. So you need to create a sentence where the subject either comes first or there is a subject in general. So please go ahead and pause me right now on YouTube. Look at those sentences, and in your notebooks, I want you to take those 4 sentences that are passive and turn them active. Spend a couple of minutes doing that, and then we will meet back up. All right, hopefully you followed my instructions and you did not skip ahead and you paused the presentation and you tried to create these sentences into active sentences. So if you take a look at these, I'll just run through the first one in specific, but I'll show you the examples for all of them. In Romeo and Juliet, there are many lessons taught that are important. In Romeo and Juliet, there are many lessons taught that are important. Where do these lessons come from? How are we learning these lessons? Who's teaching these lessons? We have our clue that we've got a form of to be that's linking this but is making it passive. So how do we turn this sentence and others like it into active sentences? Take a look here. These are all sentences that I've turned active from the previous slide. There are many ways that you could do this. These are just one way that I approach these different sentences. So if I were to revise it and to make it sound really great and active, I could change that previous sentence to William Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet is filled with many important themes and lessons. So the agency of the sentence is there. It makes sense. It's not passive. It sounds a little bit stronger. For the next one, another active sentence, Romeo and Juliet, rushing into their relationship too quickly is the play's most important lesson. Friar Lawrence illustrates this lesson best when he warns Romeo of falling in love too quickly, and Piquet's character fulfills the pedagogical function of myth in The Power of One. If you go back and compare these all to the previous slide, which I would encourage you to do, and cross-compare them with the sentences that you've written, you can see how the sentences that you are writing in literary analyses are actually more passive than they are active, and this is what we want to start working around. All right, that's where I want to stop with active versus passive voice. I don't want to get too much more in depth with it because obviously the sentences can be much more complicated, but what I want you to do is to start realizing that Generally, your subject should come before your verb, and you need a subject in your sentences, otherwise they are way, way, way too passive for literary analysis. The last thing that I want to talk about really quickly is apostrophes. And this is something that I've noticed has actually become a larger concern for all of us as the year has progressed, which is a little bit surprising to me because there is a very simple rule for using apostrophes. If I switch in here, this is something that I saw in a ton of the Romeo and Juliet essays that two of my classes wrote. In Romeo and Juliet, the Montague apostrophe S and Capulet apostrophe S were feuding families. Now, the rule for apostrophes is that apostrophes indicate possession. They don't get attached to every single word that is plural, which means more than one. Just in case you didn't know that, plural means more than one, singular means one, possession means you are owning something. So in this sentence, which I saw tons of students write, in Romeo and Juliet, the Montagues and Capulets were feuding families. If you have an apostrophe here and here, it means the Montagues and Capulets own something in this sentence. And I would challenge you to find anything that they own in this sentence because the answer is that they do not own anything in this sentence. Therefore, you absolutely do not need apostrophes there. What is happening is just that Montagues and Capulets are plural words. Therefore, all you do with a plural word is add an S at the end, no apostrophe. So any family name that you have, for example, if I were to write, oh, the Wallenfangs are from Wisconsin, I would not write Wallenfang apostrophe S are from Wisconsin. We have no ownership in that sentence. I'm just saying many Wallenfangs are from Wisconsin. Okay? So if we take a look at some of these examples here to show and to review apostrophes in the right way, again, to go back to this example, in Romeo and Juliet, the Montagues and Capulets were feuding families. These are not plural words, so therefore I do not need apostrophes there. But if I were indicating possession, I'm sorry, these are plural words, so I do not need apostrophes there, just an S. Sorry about that. In the next one, though, we do have a possessive word because Romeo owns his love for Juliet, so we need an apostrophe here. If you did not have an apostrophe there, that would be incorrect. This just means there are many Romeos, right? There could be 1,000 million Romeos, and then I would just need an S at the end. Tybalt's sword shed lots of blood. Tybalt owns the sword, right? So I need an apostrophe there because it's his sword, not Tybalt's. If it was Tybalt's without an apostrophe, that means there are 100 million Tybalts. And then finally, Mercutio told lots of tall tales. This word is plural. It means he told more than one tall tale. Therefore, I do not need an apostrophe because it's not owning anything. It's just a word that represents the fact that there are more than one. Okay? So this is what we're going to work on tomorrow in class. We're going to do some writing with this. Come in with any questions. I anticipate that you'll have some questions about active-passive voice, and we will work through those together in grammar teams. But hopefully this was not too painful for you all, and we can use this to become better writers for our final exam and beyond. All right, have a good night, everyone. I will see you in class tomorrow. Happy Fake G Day.